Welcome to Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Colleen Parsons, and my guest today is a writer, a poet, a novelist, a memoirist, and many other things, Seán Hewitt. Shawn grew up just outside Manchester in England and is now based in Dublin, where he teaches at Trinity College, Dublin. He's the author of a book of literary criticism on John Millington Synge, the great Irish playwright and prose writer, as well as 2 books of his own poetry, Tongues of Fire and Rapture's Road. His memoir, All Down Darkness Wide, was published in 2022, and a collection of queer love from the ancient world, queer love stories from the ancient world, 300,000 Kisses, was published just last year. His highly anticipated, at least anticipated by me, highly anticipated debut novel, Open Heaven, will be published in the US in April 2025. Shawn has been deservedly recognised, winning the Laurel Prize in 2021, also the Rooney Prize in Ireland, and shortlisted for the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, the John Pollard Foundation International Poetry Award, and a Dalkey Literary Award, and other things. And in 2020, he was chosen as the Sunday Times one of their 30 under 30 artists in Ireland. Across all of his work, there's a delicate, textured rendition of nature, of woods and forests, mostly in winter, seemingly dreading the cruelest month, beating and pulsing with life under its dead husks. It's work that's haunted by ghosts of past lives and possible other lives, by questions of how to live fictionally and truthfully, and by the intertwining of our lives and the lives of those we carry with us, read about, and draw sustenance from. Shawn's work is arresting. It's deeply concerned certainly concerned about how we live in and with a community, from gay men to family, that can only partially hold us. And yet his work envelops us in its sense of a trans-historical life that's only partly ours, but that gives substance to our daily life. Shawn, you are very welcome to The Writing Life. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I mentioned ghosts there because I wanted to start. That's why I was setting myself up there. And maybe to think about, since this is a conversation about your own writing life, who are the ghosts that you've been sort of living with throughout your life as a writer?
It's a really good question. I think conversation is a great way of putting it, because you kind of feel like you're in conversation with other kind of historical figures. The most obvious one to me is Gerard Manley Hopkins, who kind of turns up in All Down Darkness Wide, not just as a kind of literary figure, but also as a queer man whose own life might offer kind of lessons or warnings. But I think actually I seem to marshal a different set of ghosts for each book I'm working on. So recently I've had Edna O'Brien in my head, Edmund White, Thomas Hardy. Those are the sort of people that I pulled towards for the novel. So it's always different, but Hopkins is always behind me.
He's the major force. I'd love to ask you to read something for us, and because I'm interested in John Millington Synge, the playwright, I would love to ask you to read from your dry academic book. However, I will save the audience and ask you, would you read a few poems for us to open our conversation?
Of course. I thought I would read a poem first called Pleated Ink Caps. Now, these are just mushrooms. They grow up overnight, and then they usually by the morning will wilt down again. And they have that name because they used to be used to make ink for writing. But it's a very ghostly poem. And it's also, I suppose, me thinking about the different sorts of self that we inhabit at different times in our lives. Pleated ink caps. I am walking in the garden, barefoot, a dream perhaps, strange light. And all these blooms of glass, nocturnal, are lifting from the soil, shivering upwards on their milky stalks. Ghosts, too, rise like this. I have chosen one life, interred countless other selves. The garden is like a god with a flowering mouth. And then a very short poem The end of my first collection, Tongues of Fire, kind of ended with a series of, I called them like pre-elegies because they were written before my father died, when I knew he was dying. And Rapture's Road kind of picked up on a couple of these ideas, but are very much concerned with the aftermath. And here was just a very short poem that I wrote. It was originally about 3 pages long, but it ended up as 6 lines. It's called Snows. By my age, the snows of my father's life were already half fallen. What is that sound? The white heart leaping through its dark estate. Frost on the eyes of the animals. Frost in the mouths of the trees. I'll read you 2 more. This poem I wrote after my nephew was born, and I had to add a little note here to say it was after the birth of my nephew, because originally when I sent this anonymously to a competition, they thought it was by a woman, because it's about breastfeeding in some ways. It's called Ilex, which is just the Latin name for the holly tree family. Distracting myself, waiting for news, I walked until I saw this white cluster of holly growing at the base of a tree. The stems yellowed, the angled clutch of leaves like a bleached coral, a pale antler, almost medieval, like a relic unearthing in the gloom of the wood. Later, still the baby would not latch, and I came back to this holly, unhardened by the sun, unable to turn the light into strength. May it keep its whiteness. May it never learn the use of spikes, or in time, when a crown is made of it, may the people approach one by one to witness how a fragile thing is raised. And then, very briefly, a poem that needs no explanation. Do we have wild garlic in America?
I don't know.
Okay, so maybe it does need explanation. Wild garlic is kind of does what it says on the tin. It's garlic that grows in the wild, but it has kind of these ball-like white flowers. Wild garlic. Out in the copse after rain, too late after dark to be here. Warm soil, wood lice dripping from the underside of leaves. I root down to the tender stalks and twist them free. Soaked petals dip and touch my arm, kernels of bud, itch of foliage, of wildness on my skin. The plants are carrying the smell, earth-rich, too heavy to lift above head height, and my boots and jeans are bleached with it. I turn home, and all across the floor, the spiked white flowers light the way. The world is dark, but the wood is full of stars.
Thanks. We'll have to figure out whether there is wild garlic here. I was reading this morning again, Tongues of Fire and Rapture's Road, and I was reminded of a thing that I thought of the first time I read them, which is there's a lot of nighttime. This is nature by night. It's darkness. So you have the wild garlic are stars. In so much of your nature poetry, this is sort of encountering nature under the cover of dark in the winter. I was thinking of John Keats's phrase at the end of the Grecian urn, cold pastoral. I was wondering, would that describe in some sense your vision of the pastoral or your vision of the natural?
Very possibly. I think, in some ways the nighttime element came about because I tended to walk at night after work or whatever. So the poems tended to be set at night. But then I think what I like is a natural world reanimated by a sense of fear and mystery and kind of almost erotic intimacy that only seems to come at night to me. So I think I tend to return in the poems to a moment of possibility but also unknowingness that nighttime gives to the pastoral.
It's got none of those sort of green warmth that we associate, but it is enveloping and all-encompassing.
Yeah, I mean, I became much more conscious when I wrote Rapture's Road of the desecration of nature as well. So I wanted to set almost a post-apocalyptic or an about-to-be apocalyptic natural world for the speaker of the poem to inhabit. I didn't want a kind of fake green pastoral in which everything was perfect.
Yeah. The opening scene of your memoir, and we'll talk about whether it is a memoir or not, that sounds like, the opening scene of your memoir is set in a cemetery. It's a sort of delicious Gothic moment as you're wandering through a cemetery, and I've heard you describe the book as a Gothic memoir. So this is all down Darkness Wide. What is a Gothic memoir? I think we don't often put these two words together. The Gothic with its sort of castles and ghosts.
Yeah.
Although indeed this opens in a cathedral, so it has a sort of Gothic element.
I mean, I suppose, you know, you write a book and then you think of words to frame the book that you wrote. To me, it seemed like the ghosts of past historical figures became so important to the real life of the subject of the memoir, me, that it seemed only right to allow kind of a porousness between the past and the present, and that porousness is where the ghosts kind of seeped in. And also, I think sometimes the Gothic works in metaphors and symbols that are so potent because they feel real, or they give voice to things that we experience, like nightmares and delusions and paranoia, that are real to us in terms of experience, but the Gothic gives a kind of exterior way of thinking about them. So in a book that deals in some ways with darkness and madness and you know, a lot of Gothic subject matter, it seemed only right that the memoir kind of became a Gothic novel. And
of course, you know, half of it is set in Sweden, in the winter, under cover of darkness.
When it's dark a lot.
Yes, when it's dark a lot, and you get this sort of the sense of, in some sense, I think of like the blank pages on your parts of the pages of your poems, but even the covers of the books have a sense of the complexity of darkness. Right? The idea of darkness as being a full thing that's broken. In fact, perhaps to use a word from Beckett, stained by the arrival of light. In a way. Well, we've already spoken about poetry, not to say that we're putting that behind us. We've already spoken about prose, a memoir, and your own sort of prose writing as a scholar. And I'm wondering how you keep all of these things straight, right? So we often, you know, we speak to people, you know, poets who write short stories, or novelists who become short story writers or playwrights. But you seem to be trying to do everything all at once, and not an accusation, but I wanted to ask about like what brings you to that sort of promiscuity of form?
Perhaps a sort of restlessness, or a sense that there is such a variety of ways you might write something. Why confine yourself to just one way of writing? But it seems to me as well that, you know, now I tend to write poetry and prose and probably critical work simultaneously. They're all kind of happening at different times. And when an idea arrives, it either arrives as an idea that is a poem or arrives as an idea that has to be a novel. And an idea for a novel is like this huge idea that you have to sustain over a long period of time. Whereas an idea for a poem can just be one thing that ideally, you know, you might start and end in a day. You might have to revise it, but it's a day's stamina. Whereas a novel is, you know, 2 years stamina or 3 years stamina. But really, it just seems that they're all the same as well to me. They're all just different ways of creating an experience for a reader. So it never seems kind of strange that I would turn to prose or poetry, or it seems stranger that I could confine myself to one.
I mean, the richness of, say, All Down Darkness Wide suggests that you are a poet at heart who finds himself writing prose every now and then, even increasingly more prose.
Yeah.
I mean, what do the different forms afford you, right? So you've just finished a novel. Congratulations. Well, you must have finished about a year ago because it's coming out very shortly. What did that allow you to do? Let's say a memoir or a poem or even a book of poems, because you say a poem is the work of a day, but a book of poems, a collection, is not.
No, a collection is definitely not the work of a day. I think, well, a novel, as obvious as it sounds, allows you to make things up, which, as I'd worked in poetry and in memoir, had not been the case. I had not been necessarily entirely fictionalizing something out of thin air. So I felt a great sense of freedom in the novel, and quite a galvanizing freedom, to the point that I already kind of started another one because I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. With a poem, it's more like an espresso shot of language and ideas distilled into one small thing. But I think that the kind of first principles of writing are always the same for me, which is I have a sense of an experience that I want to subject the reader to, or to involve the reader in. And in kind of the grey matter of my brain that either emerges as I want a kind of short, sharp thing for a reader, which they will read and maybe reread, and
carry with them in that sort of an illumination, a glimpse.
Yeah, or I want to kind of get my hands on a reader for 2 weeks and get them to read something in prose, and I can kind of curate this longer kind of durational experience. Maybe it's about duration, maybe it's about time.
What if it takes them just 2 days to read it because it's so good?
They have to do it again. They have to read that.
It's interesting that you brought us to a novel being sort of the fictionality of the novel, allowing you to do certain things, because we've used the word memoir now a couple of times, and I want to ask you about the sort of the relationship between the content of that memoir, All Down Darkness Wide, and the content of your own life, and the sort of the fictionality of the thing itself. And we would think about it. It was published in the US as it said a memoir on the title, but I don't think it did in the UK or in Ireland, right? No. So even there, sort of, it's about marketing. We could think about it as a queer memoir, and not just a memoir of a queer person, but that it queers the form of memoir. So, but it's in some ways highly fictionalized.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that sort of process of writing the sort of fictional memoir or the creative memoir.
I mean, I think that any good memoir is fictionalized, by which I mean the form of a book is a fiction into which everything must be distorted to fit in. So already when I began, I knew it was going to have to be squashed and remolded to fit inside a book. But I think primarily what I care about, as I said before, is how the reader experiences the book. And as I was writing it, more and more it became apparent to me that real life was not the important thing. The important thing was that I was writing a book, and it had to work as a book. And then I suppose once I kind of cracked into the freedom that I could move things around, I had more fun. Well, I mean, it wasn't really fun, but I had more license to kind of move around in time, or to make things happen in places where they didn't happen, because as a reader you'll never know the truth anyway. A memoir could have been entirely fiction so far as you know. So really I just want you to have the most cohesive experience as a reader.
Without giving it all away, because I would encourage our viewers to read All Darkness Wide, could you tell us about why it wasn't fun? Not to ask you to go down that road, but I mean, this is a really a really intense
Yeah.
story of your own life, of queer lives across centuries, across spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I think one reason it wasn't fun is because I wrote it during the pandemic as well, or a lot of it during the pandemic, and it was quite an excavation, not just of my own life, but of other people's lives, which naturally led to a lot of anxiety. And because it was the pandemic, I didn't really have an outlet for this anxiety. When I sent the book to my editor the last time, she wrote back to me and said, God, that can't have been easy to write. But it kind of surprised me when she said it, because I hadn't really experienced the book. I didn't expect it to be a difficult or a dark book. That wasn't my sense of it until she reflected it back, and then I went back and looked at it and I thought, oh God, yeah, this is a dark book. It's dark because, you know, in many ways it lives on a precipice of what might happen.
Yeah.
It's a very fearful book. Yeah. There might be someone that's dropping over into death, into suicide, and there are these historical figures who have gone and done it in the past. And I am kind of wandering through these figures around me who might, in one moment, shift the entire fabric of my life or the life of other people. So I suppose inevitably it was going to be dark, and because the subject matter was dark.
Yeah.
When it came to actually writing the novel, I had in my head, you know, your last prose book was so dark, like this one in my head is like summer and brightness and greenness.
Even the title, Open Heaven, quite different from that extraordinary title, All Down Darkness Wide, which comes from your sort of patron saint, in a sense, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and just for viewers, again, not giving it away, you did not write a PhD thesis about Gerard Manley Hopkins,
no, that's
but
true.
you wrote a book, a memoir about writing a PhD about Gerard Manley Hopkins, and you mentioned him as one of your ghosts, and I want to encourage you to go back to that figure, the sort of the classic poet maudit of like the 19th century and 19th century poetry. Not the only one, but you know, in many ways stuck in what he thought of as a backward town, Dublin, in the late 19th century, teaching Greek and Latin to the cream of Irish society, which is to say rich and thick. All of those things at the same time, perhaps being a queer writer, or certainly queer, but perhaps being a gay writer. So tell us more about Gerard Manley Hopkins as the sort of the figure, an incredible portrait of Gerard Manley Hopkins emerges in the book.
The more time I spent reading Hopkins, so he was a priest, he was constantly kind of written about as though he was effeminate, strange. A lot of people thought he couldn't be very intelligent because he kind of seemed like he wasn't quite connecting with the world around him, but his writing shows that he was absolutely connecting in like an extraordinary, but perhaps interior way that wasn't expressed to other people around him. And he kind of failed at being a priest in many ways, because he went out and gave these sermons that were completely unintelligible to most people. And he was just like intellectually up on this plane, and it was a lonely place to be because there was no one else that was getting into him. And I think also a bit of a Tory, which is why he didn't like Dublin, he hated Liverpool, he hated Glasgow, signs of poverty, you know, he couldn't deal with it. Didn't like the Irish.
Seems like a problem.
But with the most incredibly sensitive mind, that if you read his poems and you read his diaries, you feel that you kind of want to go and save him, or that you want to know him. Because I think he felt so unknown during his life. There's something about witnessing him through his writing that feels like repaying that sense of isolation.
Speaking of repaying a sense of isolation, you have been in isolation writing a novel.
Mm-hmm.
Would you release some of that novel to us, release it to the world for a few minutes for us today?
Yeah, do you want me to read something?
Yeah.
So
again, the title is Open Heaven.
Open Heaven, and you were talking before about kind of greenness and lushness, and I hope that that's something of what this book feels like. I'll just read you kind of the opening page. It's set in, well, this part is in 2022. It's and then it moves back, and most of the novel is set in 2002. Time runs faster backwards. The years, long, arduous, and uncertain, when taken one by one, unspool quickly, turning liquid. So one summer becomes a shimmering light that, almost as soon as it appears in the mind, is subsumed into a dark winter, a relapse of blackness that flashes to reveal a face, a fireside, a snow-encrusted garden. And then the garden sends its snow upwards into the sky, gathers back its fallen leaves, and blooms again in reverse. The faces smile at me back there at the far end of the reel. They are younger, more innocent, lighter. If, now that I am in my adulthood, time seems like a silted riverbed I cannot wade through, I find more often than before that I can spin it backwards, can turn it into a flow of waters, warmer, sweeter, washing the years away, carrying me with them.
Seán, I have a million more questions.
Yep.
I'd love to keep chatting. Really looking forward to the novel. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. And thank you for joining us on this episode of Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life.